Hey guys, my name's Zach. I'm going to talk to you today about how on the cross Jesus gives us life. So, to start off, I want to tell you guys a story. Now this is a story about a hero, but a flawed hero. It's a story about unbelievable strength, but it's also a story about someone who makes a lot of mistakes. And it's also a story about God's faithfulness. It's a story about Samson. Now, Samson. Some of you guys may have heard of Samson. His story can be found in the book of Judges in the Bible in chapters 13 to 16. So, let's dive in. Well, you guys have heard of Old Testament priests, right? Well, Samson wasn't born as a priest, but he was born as a Nazarite, which means he was actually specially set apart by God. In fact, his mum was actually told when Samson was born that Samson would be specially set aside for God. And the way that Samson had to honor God and trust God and listen to God was to make sure that he never cut his hair. And God actually blessed Samson as long as Samson kept this promise and kept his hair long, that God will give him unbelievable strength. Now, I'm sure many of you guys have heard of Captain America in Marvel. He's just here. But Samson is like Captain America times 10. Unfortunately, however, Samson does not always use his strength for God. He frequently uses it for himself. In fact, basically, one time Samson was betrayed by someone, and he got so angry that he picked up the jawbone of a donkey, which is, it's up here on the screen, and he used it to kill 300 Philistines. Now, Philistines were the enemies of Israel at the time, and Samson, because of his amazing strength, was actually the ruler of Israel. He killed 300 men with a jawbone of a donkey. This guy was incredible. An unbelievable athlete, an unbelievable man, so strong. But he didn't use it for God. In fact, he didn't obey God's vision of marriage either. He was interested in all types of different women, and he married women from nations all over the place. In fact, he even married Philistine women. And that clearly was not what God wanted, because they were the enemies of Israel at the time. Now, God still allowed him to keep his strength, even though Samson wasn't using it for God at all. He was using it for himself. Even though he was the ruler of God's people, he was just kind of doing his own thing. But God allowed him to keep his strength because his hair stayed long and never got cut. However, eventually, Samson decided to settle down with a Philistine woman, one of the women from the enemy nation of Israel, which does not seem very smart. And her name was Delilah. Now, Delilah was actually a spy. She was paid by the rulers of the Philistines to basically find out a way of sabotaging Samson. So, she, did whatever Samson wanted, but she was trying to undermine him. She was trying to get rid of him. And she kept asking him. She kept saying, how are you so strong? How are you so amazing in battle? Obviously, he had incredible strength, absurd strength. And so she knew there had to be some secret. It was superhuman. And Samson, because he was proud, and I think because he liked the attention and he liked the game of it, he actually kept listening to her. But he lied to her. He told her many times all these different tricks and all these different things about why he was strong. But none of them were actually true. And basically what would happen is she would tie him up, and she would do whatever he had said would get rid of his strength, and then she would call in the Philistine army. And the Philistine army would come in and they'd try to capture Samson, but he still had his strength because he still had his hair. so he would defeat the army, kill all the people, and he would be happy as Larry, just keep on living. And for some reason, he kept trusting Delilah throughout all of this, even though multiple times, over and over and over, this kept happening. And she kept on bugging him, and she kept on bugging him, and she kept on bugging him. And eventually, Samson told her the secret. He told her that if they cut his hair, if his hair is cut, he'll lose all of his strength. And so, one night, while Samson was asleep, Delilah tied him up, and she cut his hair. And so then she called in the Philistine army, and they came in to attack him. And he, of course, expected that, just like all the other times, he would wake up, he'd break through the ropes, and he'd defeat the army. But this time his hair was cut, and God took away his strength. Samson had trusted in his own strength, and he had not trusted in what God had said. He thought he would still have his strength, and he disobeyed God. And the Philistines took him. They attacked him, they tortured him, they even cut out his eyes, and so he couldn't see, and he was humiliated. He was taken to the king of the Philistines in the area at the time. There were multiple Philistine kings, and he was locked away in a dark cell, and he was starved, and he was tortured. And every now and then, when the king was feeling extra cruel, he would bring out Samson in front of all the people, all of his court, and he would make fun of Samson, and they would spit on him, and they would mock him and yell at him, and they would make him do humiliating things like little dances and things like that for them. And so Samson had gone from up here to actually below the floor, like just humiliated, utterly humiliated. So what did he do? He was there for multiple months. He was locked away in this dark cell, in this cycle of just getting humiliated over and over and over again, and he did not have his strength. And he realized, eventually, he came to his senses, and he realized that it was God who'd given him the strength, and it wasn't his strength in the first place. It was God's strength. And so he repented, and he asked God for forgiveness for all the terrible things that he'd done, and all the ways he'd misused the gift that God had given him. And God listened to him. God had not completely forsaken him throughout all this time when Samson didn't care about God, just ignored him. And God forgave him, which is amazing. Now, Samson was not done yet. God had one more thing in store for Samson. Let's pick up the story of Samson in Judges chapter 16, verse 28. Let's read. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me get, with one blow, revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Now, for context, Samson had been brought out in front of the Philistine temple, basically the palace where all the kings were, and there was actually a meeting of multiple kings at the time. All the kings from the Philistine Empire from all over had come, and they'd come to mock Samson. And so he'd been brought out, and he was being made fun of, and he was being spat on. And so Samson, with one last cry, does what God's will is. So let's pick it up again. Then Samson, reaching toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them with his right hand on one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Samson sacrificed his life in the end to do God's will. Right at the end of his life, he trusted in God, and God forgave him, and God gave him his strength back, and he took down the entire palace and all of the kings inside. Now, Samson was an extremely flawed man, an extremely flawed ruler, but he does actually have some similarities with Jesus. Jesus, in many ways, is what Samson should have been. He trusted God his whole life. He had unbelievable power, actually far more power than Samson ever had. But he chose to use it to help, to do God's will, to heal people, to look after the sick, to do miracles, to preach about God's kingdom. Samson had to be humbled, humiliated, in fact, to realize life that the way that God had set it up was actually better. But Jesus willingly took himself to the cross. He humiliated himself, not the other way around. He was mocked and he was spat on, and he was made fun of by all of his enemies, even as he was dying. Samson, in dying, finally won the battle over his enemies. Because all the kings were there and he took down the palace with all of them in it, he actually wiped out the entire Philistine empire as the Lord knew it then, and it never recovered. God used him to take down what was actually the most cruel and oppressive empire in the entire world. Jesus' death on the cross gives us life by defeating the enemies of God's kingdom. By rising from the dead, Jesus took all the punishment from us and showed that sin and death is not the victor. Now, Samson's death was perhaps the most epic human death there has ever been. He took out about 3,000 people, and as I said, the entire Philistine empire. But we can take away two things from the story of Samson. Number one, on one level, Samson was, in one way, the precursor. I guess he was a really bad example, a really bad first version of what Christ was the perfect version of. Someone who had all that power, was ordained by God. In fact, Jesus was God. So in some ways, Samson and Jesus are nothing alike. But Jesus was the perfect hero, not the flawed hero. And we know Jesus is what we need. He's the one who gives us life. It's not just in his dying that he showed us how to live. He showed us all throughout his life. But he does defeat death. And he wins for us a new life. But we can also learn from Samson ourselves. Sometimes we like to think that we are in control and we are the ones that are strong and we're the ones that are powerful when we're young, especially because we have a lot going for us. But the truth is that God is the one that's in control. God is the one that decides how life will be. If we trust in God, and if we trust in the life that Jesus won for us on the cross by defeating his enemies, then we should want to live for him. So let's talk now in our groups about what living for Christ actually looks like. Thanks.